The Draconus Empire stretched across 12 star systems, and every living creature in those systems knew the name of Emperor Vexarian the Undying, the ancient dragon lord who had ruled for 10,000 years. His scales as black as the void between stars, and his eyes burning with the fire of 1,000 suns. His species called themselves the Korethi, and they were the most feared predators in the known galaxy. Standing 12 feet tall with wings that could block out the light and claws that could tear through starship hulls like paper, they measured everything by strength, by fire, by the ability to survive the harshest conditions the universe could throw at them. And they had built their entire civilization on one simple principle: the weak must perish so the strong can thrive. This was the way of the Dragon Lords. And it had been this way since before humanity had learned to walk upright on their little blue planet called Earth. But now, in the heart of the Imperial Palace on the volcanic world of Draconus Prime, something was going terribly wrong. The Emperor's eggs had begun to hatch 3 months too early in a specially designed chamber deep within the palace. 7 tiny hatchlings struggled to survive, their bodies too small and too weak and too underdeveloped to handle the brutal realities of Korethi existence. Their scales, which should have gleamed like polished obsidian, were thin and dull and flaking away like old paint. Their flame glands, the organs that allowed adult Korethi to breathe fire hot enough to melt steel, produced nothing but sad little wisps of smoke that faded almost as soon as they appeared. Their tiny bodies could not regulate the extreme temperatures that their species required to survive. The Empire's greatest physicians worked around the clock, trying everything they knew and everything they could imagine. They calibrated thermal chambers to within a fraction of a degree, creating environments that matched the exact conditions of a healthy Korethi nest. They developed nutrient slurries derived from volcanic minerals and rare elements found only in the cores of dying stars. They attempted experimental genetic therapies that had never been tried before. Desperate measures for desperate times. One by one, the hatchlings died. The first died after 2 days, its tiny body simply giving up the fight. It was never strong enough to win. The second lasted 3 days before its flame gland ruptured from the strain of trying to produce fire. It was not ready to create. The third and fourth died together on the 5th day, curled around each other as if seeking comfort that the Korethi did not believe in giving. By the end of the 2nd week, only one hatchling remained, and it was fading fast. The Emperor himself came to the medical chambers, something he had not done in over a century, and the physicians trembled before him as they delivered their report. "We have tried everything, Your Eternal Majesty," said Sovereign Healer Draxus, the most respected physician in the Empire, his golden scales marking him as one of the elite healer caste. "The hatchling will not survive another 3 days, and there is nothing more we can do." For the first time in living memory, something like grief flickered across the Emperor's ancient face. These were his children, the first he had sired in 300 years. The heirs who were supposed to carry his legacy into the next 10,000 years of Korethi dominance. "Summon specialists from across the galaxy," the Emperor commanded, his voice like thunder rolling across mountains. "Every species, every world, every scientist and healer who might have even the smallest chance of saving my heir, bring them here." And so the call went out across 12 star systems and beyond, reaching the territories of 100 different species, promising unimaginable rewards to anyone who could save the last surviving hatchling of Emperor Vexarian. The undying ships arrived from every corner of known space, carrying the greatest minds of a dozen civilizations. There were the crystalline architects of Nexus 7, beings of living gemstone who understood biology as a form of sacred geometry. There were the high physicians of the Montari Collective, insectoid doctors who had mastered the art of genetic manipulation over millions of years. There were the probability surgeons of the Quantic Federation, who could calculate medical outcomes across infinite possible timelines. Each one examined the dying hatchling. Each one tried their most advanced techniques. And each one failed. The hatchling grew weaker with each passing hour, its vital signs dropping like stones sinking into deep water. And then, almost as an afterthought, someone remembered the humans. There was a human medical officer stationed on the Imperial Station, part of a minor diplomatic exchange that nobody had paid much attention to. A gesture of goodwill from a species the Karethi considered barely worth noticing. Her name was Ara Chun, and she worked in the neonatal intensive care unit, caring for premature human babies who came into the universe too soon and too small. She was not a xenobiologist or a geneticist or a specialist in alien physiology. She was just a nurse, a caregiver, someone who spent her days and nights helping tiny, fragile lives find their way into the world. When the summons came, she thought there must be some mistake. "They want me to examine a dragon hatchling," she said to her supervisor, disbelief clear in her voice. "I take care of human babies. I do not know anything about alien species." "Orders are orders," her supervisor replied with a shrug. The Emperor himself commanded that every available medical professional be brought before him, and that includes you. So Ara Chun, a 34-year-old human woman who stood barely 5.5 feet tall and had never seen a Karethi hatchling in her life, found herself walking into the most important medical chamber in the entire empire. The physicians looked at her with barely concealed contempt. Here was this small, soft creature, this representative of a species that had only discovered faster than light travel a mere 2 centuries ago, daring to stand among the greatest healers in the galaxy. Draxus did not even try to hide his disdain as he briefed her on the situation, his tone making it clear that he considered this entire exercise a waste of precious time. But Alara was not looking at Draxus. She was looking at the hatchling in the thermal chamber, watching the way its tiny body trembled, the way its dull eyes stared at nothing, the way it lay alone in the center of all that advanced technology, surrounded by dozens of physicians, and not one of them actually touching it, or talking to it, or offering it any comfort at all. She had seen that look before, in human babies who were failing to thrive, despite receiving perfect medical care. "It is cold," she said quietly. Almost to herself, Draxus heard her and nearly laughed out loud. "The chamber is calibrated to the optimal developmental temperature for Karethi hatchlings," he said with condescension dripping from every word. "I assure you, human, the creature is not cold." Alara shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the struggling hatchling. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the powerful beings surrounding her. "It is not physically cold, it is emotionally cold. It is alone. And it is dying because nobody is holding it." The chamber fell absolutely silent. Every Karethi in the room stared at her as if she had just spoken the most offensive words in their entire language. And somewhere in the shadows, Emperor Vexarian the Undying leaned forward on his throne, suddenly very interested in what this small human had to say. The medical chamber erupted into chaos the moment Alara finished speaking. A dozen Karethi physicians began shouting at once, their voices overlapping in a storm of outrage and disbelief, their scales flushing darker with anger as they processed what this small human had dared to suggest. "Emotionally cold," Draxus repeated, his golden scales almost brown with fury. "You stand in the presence of the greatest medical minds in 12-star systems, and you tell us that the Emperor's heir is dying because nobody is holding it. That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard in 800 years of medical practice," another physician added, his wings flaring with indignation. "The Karethi do not coddle their young," a third physician said, stepping toward Alara with clear menace in his posture. "We are warriors, conquerors, the apex predators of the known galaxy. And we do not embrace our hatchlings like frightened animals seeking comfort. Alara stood her ground, even though every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. These beings were 3 times her size and could kill her with a casual swipe of their claws. And she could see the contempt in their eyes, the absolute certainty that she was nothing more than a primitive creature from a primitive world who had no business speaking in their presence. But she had seen too many babies die to stay silent now. In human medicine, she began, her voice calm and steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. We learned something important about premature infants many years ago. We do not care about your primitive medicine. Draxus interrupted. Let her speak, came a voice like rolling thunder, and every Korethi in the chamber immediately fell silent and dropped their eyes to the floor. Emperor Vexarian stepped out of the shadows, his massive form seeming to fill the entire room. His ancient eyes fixed on Alara with an intensity that made her skin prickle with heat. You have something to say. Human, the Emperor said, and it was not a question. Say it. Alara swallowed hard and forced herself to meet his burning gaze. Your Majesty, she began. When human babies are born too early, they are small and weak, and their bodies are not ready for the world. Much like your hatchlings. The Emperor nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. For many years, we put these babies in machines, Alara continued. We gave them perfect temperatures and perfect nutrition and perfect medical care. And still many of them died or failed to grow properly. Then your medicine is even more primitive than we thought. Draxus muttered under his breath. The Emperor silenced him with a look that promised severe consequences for further interruptions. Then we discovered something. Alara said, we found that babies who were held against their mother's skin, who heard their mother's heartbeats and felt their mother's warmth and heard their mother's voices, those babies survived at much higher rates than babies who received only medical care. She paused to let this sink in, watching the confusion spread across the faces of the Korethi physicians. We call it kangaroo care, she explained. The baby is placed skin to skin against the parent, wrapped close to their chest and held for hours at a time. Then something happens in that contact that we still do not fully understand. Something happens, Draxus repeated with clear skepticism. That is your scientific explanation. Something happens. Yes, Alara admitted. We know that touch releases certain chemicals in the baby's brain. We know that hearing a heartbeat regulates their own heart rhythm. We know that the presence of a caregiver reduces stress hormones that can damage development. But there is more to it than just chemistry. She turned to look at the dying hatchling in the thermal chamber, watching its labored breathing and its trembling limbs. There is a feedback loop between the body and something deeper, she said softly. The body needs care to grow, but the spirit also needs to know that it is wanted, that it is loved, that someone in this universe cares whether it lives or dies. The silence that followed her words was absolute. Then Draxus began to laugh, a harsh sound like rocks grinding together. The spirit, he said, making the words sound like an insult. You are telling us that the heir to the Draconus Empire is dying because its spirit is sad. This is mysticism. This is superstition. This is the kind of soft thinking that has kept your species crawling in the dirt while we conquered the stars. Several other physicians joined in the laughter, and Alara felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. Our hatchlings do not need coddling, Draxus continued, his voice rising with conviction. The trials exist to separate the strong from the weak. And if a hatchling cannot survive on its own, then it does not deserve to survive at all. This is the way of the Korethi. This is what has made us great. Then your greatness is killing your emperor's children. Alara shot back before she could stop herself. The laughter stopped instantly. Every eye in the room turned to her with expressions ranging from shock to murderous rage. Draxus took a step toward her, his claws extending, his flame glands beginning to glow with building heat. "You dare speak to me in such a manner," he growled. "You dare insult the traditions of the Dragon Lords. I will burn the flesh from your bones for such insolence." "Enough," the Emperor said. And his voice was so cold that frost actually formed on the metal surfaces of the medical equipment. Nearby, Draxus froze mid-step, his flames dying as quickly as they had appeared. The Emperor moved past his physician and stood directly in front of Alara, towering over her like a mountain of black scales and ancient power. "You believe your method can save my heir," he said. It was not a question. But Alara answered anyway. "I believe it is worth trying, Your Majesty. I have seen babies who should have died grow strong and healthy because someone held them and loved them and refused to let them go. And if you are wrong," Alara took a deep breath, "then I am wrong. And your hatchling dies, which is what will happen anyway if nothing changes." The Emperor studied her for a long moment, his burning eyes seeming to look straight through her skin and into whatever soul she might possess. "You will demonstrate your method," he said finally. "On my last surviving hatchling, you will hold it as you describe. You will speak to it and care for it as if it were one of your own human young." "Your Majesty," Draxus protested, "you cannot allow this primitive to—" "If the hatchling dies," the Emperor continued, as if Draxus had not spoken, "you will die with it. That is the price of failure in my empire." Alara felt her heart stop for a moment, then start again with painful intensity. She was being offered the chance to save a life. But if she failed, her own life would be the cost. She thought about refusing, about admitting that she did not know if her methods would work on an alien species, about going back to her quiet job on the station and pretending this had never happened. But then she looked at the hatchling again, at its tiny trembling body and its dull, desperate eyes, and she knew she could not walk away. "I accept," she said. The Emperor nodded once, then turned to address the assembled physicians. "Clear the chamber," he commanded. "Give the human whatever she requires, and if anyone interferes with her work, I will consider it an act of treason against the throne." As the physicians filed out, many of them shooting Alara looks of pure hatred, she walked slowly toward the thermal chamber and the dying hatchling within. "Hello, little one," she whispered softly. "My name is Alara, and I am going to take care of you now." The hatchling turned its head slightly at the sound of her voice, and for just a moment, something flickered in its dull eyes. It was not much, but it was enough. Alara got to work. The first thing Alara did was request materials from the station's fabrication units. She needed heat-resistant fabric that could withstand temperatures that would cook a normal human alive. She needed padding that could protect her fragile body from sharp scales and tiny claws. And she needed a harness that would allow her to hold the hatchling close to her chest while keeping her hands free. The fabricators worked through the night, and by morning, Alara had everything she needed. The Karethi physicians watched from observation windows as she prepared, their expressions ranging from curious to contemptuous, most of them clearly expecting to witness a quick failure followed by an even quicker execution. Draxus stood at the front of the group, his golden scales gleaming in the artificial light, a small smile playing at the corners of his lipless mouth. "She will be dead by sunset," he predicted to the physician standing next to him. "And we can get back to real medicine." Inside the chamber, Alara took a deep breath and opened the thermal unit where the hatchling lay. The heat hit her immediately, waves of scorching air that made her eyes water and her skin prickle with pain even through her protective gear. The hatchling looked even worse up close. Its scales were flaking off in patches, revealing pale, vulnerable skin beneath. Its eyes were clouded and unfocused, and its breathing came in short, painful gasps that shook its entire tiny body. Its flame gland, a small organ at the back of its throat that Alara could see pulsing weakly, produced nothing but thin wisps of gray smoke. "It is all right," Alara said softly as she reached into the unit. "I know you are scared and tired and alone, but I am here now, and I am not going to leave you." The hatchling flinched when her hands touched it, a reflexive response to contact that the Karethi physicians had assured her was completely normal. Karethi did not touch their young except to feed them or move them from place to place. And even then the contact was minimal and efficient. The idea of holding a hatchling for comfort was so foreign to their culture that they literally did not have words for it in their language. Alara lifted the tiny creature carefully and settled it against her chest, wrapping it in the special harness that held it secure against her body. The hatchling weighed almost nothing, maybe 3 or 4 pounds at most, and she could feel every ridge of its spine through the thin protective layer between them. "There we go," she murmured as she adjusted the straps. "Is that better? You are safe now. I've got you." For the first few hours, nothing seemed to change. The hatchling lay against her chest, its breathing still labored, its body still trembling, its vital signs still slowly declining on the monitors that the physicians insisted on keeping active. Draxus checked the readings every 30 minutes, and each time his smile grew a little wider. "The human method," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Holding the dying and pretending that love is medicine. How touching, how primitive, how utterly useless." But Alara ignored him and kept doing what she did best. She talked to the hatchling constantly, telling it stories about Earth, about the blue oceans and the green forests and the mountains that touched the clouds. She described the sun rising over her childhood home, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that the hatchling would probably never see. She told it about her family, about her mother who had taught her to be gentle and her father who had taught her to be strong. She sang to it old lullabies that her grandmother had sung to her when she was small and scared and needed to know that someone cared. The Karethi translators could barely process the sounds, marking them as meaningless vocalizations with no informational content. But the hatchling seemed to hear something in those sounds that the translators could not capture on the second day. Alara noticed that the hatchling had stopped trembling on the 3rd day. Its breathing became deeper and more regular on the 4th day. Its eyes began to clear, the cloudiness fading to reveal pupils that were deep red like cooling embers on the 5th day. Something remarkable happened. Alara was humming a tune her grandmother used to sing, a simple melody about stars and wishes and dreams coming true. When she felt warmth building against her chest, she looked down to see the hatchling's flame gland pulsing with actual light. Not the dull gray of dying embers, but the bright orange of living fire. "That is it," she whispered encouragingly. "Come on, little one, you can do it." The hatchling opened its mouth, and for the first time in its short, painful life, it breathed actual flame. It was small, barely enough to light a candle, but it was real fire, proof that the hatchling's body was finally starting to work the way it was supposed to. Alara laughed with pure joy, even as the flame singed her protective covering and left small burn marks on the heat-resistant fabric. She did not let go. Outside the observation window, Draxus had stopped smiling. The other physicians were murmuring to each other in confused voices, checking and rechecking the monitors as if they suspected some kind of malfunction. The readings were clear. The hatchling's vital signs were improving. Its body temperature was stabilizing. Its flame gland was producing actual combustion for the first time since it had hatched. "This is impossible," Draxus said flatly. "The human has done nothing. She has added no medications, adjusted no parameters, changed nothing about the treatment protocol. She is holding it," one of the younger physicians observed quietly. "Holding it is not medicine." Draxus snapped back, but the evidence was right in front of their eyes, undeniable and inexplicable. By the end of the first week, the hatchling was feeding on its own. accepting the nutrient slurry that it had previously rejected with the stubborn refusal of a creature that had given up on living. Its scales began to darken from sickly pale gray to the deep black that marked a healthy Karethi, and the patches where scales had fallen off were slowly filling in with new growth. It made sounds now, chirping noises that the adult Karethi had not heard in millennia, because their culture taught them to be silent and stoic from the moment of hatching. The sounds seemed to be responses to Alara's voice, attempts at communication from a creature too young to form proper words, but desperate to connect with the being who had shown it kindness. Alara named it Ember, though she was careful to only use the name when no Karethi were listening. The official designation was Imperial Heir Designate 7, the seventh egg of the Emperor's clutch, and the only one who had survived. But in her heart, it was just Ember, a tiny fierce creature who had fought its way back from death because someone had finally given it a reason to live. The Emperor came to observe on the 8th day, standing in silence at the observation window for nearly an hour, while Alara sang lullabies and told stories and let the hatchling practice breathing small flames against her protective gear. "How is this possible?" he said finally, his voice carrying easily through the speakers that connected the observation area to the medical chamber. Alara looked up at him. This ancient being who had ruled an empire longer than her entire species had existed as a civilization. "I do not know exactly, Your Majesty," she admitted honestly. "The science is not fully understood even among humans. But we have learned that survival is not just about the body." "Explain," the Emperor commanded. Alara thought for a moment, searching for words that could bridge the gap between their two ways of understanding the universe. "A body without hope gives up," she said finally. "Even if all its physical needs are met, even if the temperature is perfect and the nutrition is optimal and every medical parameter is exactly correct, a body without hope will find a way to die." She looked down at Ember, who was watching her face with those newly cleared red eyes. "Your hatchling was alone," she continued, "surrounded by the best technology and the greatest physicians in the galaxy, but completely alone, and on some level that we cannot measure with machines. It knew that no one was fighting for it, that no one would mourn if it died, that its existence did not matter to anyone. And you changed that," the Emperor said. "I tried to," Alara replied. "I held it and talked to it and sang to it because that is what I would do for any baby in my care. And somewhere in that contact, it found a reason to keep fighting." The Emperor was silent for a long moment, his ancient face unreadable. "The Karethi have not shown tenderness to their young in 10,000 years, he said finally. "We believed it made them weak, that only by surviving alone could they prove their worth. Maybe it did make them strong," Alara said carefully, aware that she was treading on dangerous ground. "But it also meant that the ones who needed just a little help, the ones who could have been great if someone had given them a chance, those ones all died." She looked down at Ember again, at the small fierce creature breathing tiny flames against her chest. "Your heir would be dead now if you had followed tradition," she said quietly. "How many others died over the centuries who did not have to? How much was lost because no one was willing to simply hold them and tell them that they mattered?" The Emperor did not answer, but Alara saw something shift in his ancient eyes. Something that might have been doubt, or might have been the first crack in 10,000 years of absolute certainty. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Alara alone with Ember, and the watching physicians and the feeling that something very important had just begun to change. Word spread through the Draconus Empire like wildfire racing across a dry forest. The human female had saved the Emperor's heir through softness, through affection, through methods that contradicted everything the Karethi had believed about themselves for 10,000 years. At first, the news was whispered in private chambers and secure communication channels. shared between trusted friends and family members who could hardly believe what they were hearing. But secrets do not stay secret for long in an empire of billions. And within weeks, the story of Nurse Ara Chun and the impossible hatchling had reached every corner of Karethi space. The reactions were as explosive as anyone could have predicted on the mining colonies of the outer systems. Workers stopped their shifts to debate whether the reports could possibly be true. In the military academies, where young Karethi trained to become warriors, instructors struggled to answer questions from cadets who wanted to know if everything they had been taught was wrong. In the temples, where the ancient priests maintained the spiritual traditions of the Dragon Lords, there were heated arguments about whether the human success was a blessing from the gods or a corruption sent to test their faith. Some called it a miracle, proof that the universe held mysteries beyond even Karethi understanding. A new religious movement began to form around the idea that the gods had sent the human woman to show them a path they had lost long ago. A way of being that their ancestors had known before the trials had hardened their hearts. Others called it heresy, an assault on the very foundations of everything that made the Karethi great. Draxus became the leader of this faction, traveling from world to world to give speeches about the danger the human represented. She has not saved our emperor's heir, he proclaimed to crowds of thousands. She has infected it with weakness, with dependency, with the soft thinking of a species that cannot survive without constant coddling. He painted terrifying pictures of what would happen if the Empire adopted human methods. Imagine a generation of Karethi who cannot stand on their own, he said, his voice rising with passionate conviction. Imagine warriors who need to be held and comforted before they can fight. Imagine rulers who cannot make hard decisions because they were never taught that hardship is the price of greatness. Many listened to him, especially the older Karethi who had spent their entire lives believing in the way of the trials, the warrior clans, families who had built their identities on the cruelty of the traditional methods, rallied behind Draxus and demanded that the human be executed before her contamination could spread any further. But something unexpected was happening among the younger generations in universities and research centers across the empire. Young Karethi began asking questions that their elders had never considered. If holding a hatchling helped it survive, what else might they have been wrong about? What other weaknesses might actually be strengths if viewed from a different perspective? What had been lost over the millennia because the Karethi had been so afraid of appearing soft that they had cut away every gentle part of themselves? An underground movement began to form. Karethi who wanted to study human methods, who whispered to each other about the possibility that their empire's long stagnation might be connected to their suppression of all tenderness. Because the truth was that the Karethi had not produced new art in over 1,000 years. They had not developed new philosophy or created new music or written new literature. Their technology advanced through slow incremental improvements rather than brilliant breakthroughs. Their society was stable. Yes, but it was the stability of a rock that sits in the same place for millennia because it lacks the energy to move. The young rebels wondered if perhaps the trials that were supposed to make them strong had actually made them brittle. If cutting away all softness had also cut away the creativity and passion and love that drove other species to greatness. Alara knew nothing of these debates at first. She was too busy caring for Ember, who grew stronger with each passing day, but still required constant attention and affection to maintain its progress. She had become a prisoner of her own success, unable to leave the medical chamber because Ember had imprinted on her so completely that removing her might cause the hatchling to relapse. The Emperor assigned guards to watch her at all times, ostensibly for her protection, but clearly also to ensure she did not try to escape or share her knowledge without permission. She was treated as something between an honored guest and a dangerous prisoner. Given comfortable quarters adjacent to the medical chamber, but not allowed to leave the palace complex. Her communications with Earth were monitored, and restricted visitors were carefully screened and supervised at night. When the guards thought she was sleeping, she would sit with Ember curled against her chest and tell it stories about a world it would probably never see. On Earth, she would whisper, "People hold their babies all the time, not because they are weak, but because they love them. Because touch is how we tell each other that we are not alone in the universe." Ember would chirp softly in response, sounds that were becoming more complex as it grew, almost like it was trying to speak. "Your people think that love makes you weak," Alara continued. "But where I come from, we believe that love is what gives you the strength to keep going when everything else has failed." She did not know that the Emperor had installed hidden microphones in her quarters. She did not know that he listened to these nighttime conversations every morning, playing the recordings in his private chambers where no one could see the expressions that crossed his ancient face. She did not know that her words were slowly working there, way into the heart of a being who had not allowed himself to feel anything soft in over 5,000 years. What she did know was that Ember was thriving at 3 months old. The hatchling was twice the size it had been when she first held it, with scales that gleamed like polished obsidian and a flame gland that could produce jets of fire hot enough to melt steel. It could walk now and fly short distances, and it followed Alara everywhere she went within the medical complex with a devotion that made the Karithi guards deeply uncomfortable. It had learned to speak basic words, surprising everyone because Karithi hatchlings were not supposed to vocalize until at least 6 months of age. The first word it spoke clearly was a human word. Mama Alara had cried when she heard it, tears streaming down her face while Ember chirped with confused concern and tried to lick them away. The guards reported this incident to Draxus, who used it as evidence in his campaign against her. "She has corrupted the air so completely that it speaks in the human tongue," he announced to his followers. "It calls her mother, as if she had given birth to it, as if a human could be the parent of a dragon lord." The demand for Alara's execution grew louder, backed now not just by cultural conservatives, but by those who genuinely feared what Ember might become, an heir to the throne who thought of a human as its mother, who had been raised with human values of love and tenderness. What would such a being do when it took power? Would it tear down everything the Karithi had built in the name of soft human ideals? Would it make the Empire weak just when it needed to be strong? Draxus began to gather allies among the military commanders and the noble houses, building support for an action that everyone knew was coming, but no one was willing to name out loud. The Emperor observed all of this from his throne, saying nothing, giving no indication of which side he favored, and Alara, isolated in her gilded prison with only Ember for company, felt the tension building around her like pressure before a storm. Something was coming, something that would determine not just her fate and Ember's fate, but the future of an entire empire. She just had to hope that when it arrived, all those nights of love and tenderness and whispered stories would be enough to face it. The attack came at midnight, when the palace was quiet and most of the guards had changed shifts. Draxus led 20 of his most loyal followers through the corridors of the medical wing, their scales painted black to hide in the shadows, their weapons powered down to avoid detection by the security systems. They moved like ghosts, eliminating the few guards they encountered with quick, efficient strikes that left no time for alarms. The human dies first, Draxus instructed his followers as they approached Alara's quarters. Then the hatchling. We will tell the Empire that the human's methods finally failed and took the air with her. A tragedy that proves the danger of abandoning our traditions. He actually believed he was saving his people and his mind. Killing Elara and Ember was not murder but surgery, cutting away a corruption before it could spread throughout the body of the Empire. The future he feared was too terrible to allow. A future where Karethi held their children and sang to them and told them they were loved. A future where everything he had suffered through the trials was revealed to be meaningless cruelty rather than necessary strength. He would not let that future exist. Elara was awake when they came, sitting in her usual spot with Ember curled against her chest, singing soft lullabies into the darkness. She had felt the tension building for weeks and had known that something like this was inevitable. What she had not known was what she would do when it happened. The door to her quarters exploded inward, torn off its hinges by focused plasma fire, and Draxus stepped through the smoking gap with his weapon raised and his eyes burning with righteous fury. "Your contamination ends tonight, human," he said, his voice steady and cold. "You and your creation will die here, and the Empire will return to the path of strength." Elara stood slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, her arms wrapped protectively around Ember. "The hatchling has done nothing wrong," she said, fighting to keep her voice from trembling. "It is innocent. It did not choose any of this. It is an abomination," Draxus replied. "A dragon lord raised with human weakness, taught to love rather than to conquer. It cannot be allowed to take the throne. Surely you understand that." Elara looked at the weapons pointed at her, at the cold certainty in the eyes of the Karethi who had come to kill her, and she understood that she had about 30 seconds to live. But she also understood something else, something that filled her with a strange peace. Even as death approached, she had not failed whatever happened in the next few moments. She had shown this empire that tenderness was not weakness, that love was not corruption, that a tiny hatchling who should have died could grow strong and beautiful when someone simply held it and told it that it mattered, even if she died tonight. "That truth would live on, Ember," she whispered softly. "I want you to know that I love you. No matter what happens next, remember that someone loved you. Remember that you were worth saving." Draxus raised his weapon. "Touching last words," he said with contempt. "They will be forgotten by morning." He fired, but the shot never reached Elara. Ember moved faster than anything its size should have been able to move, launching itself off her chest and placing its small body directly between her and the plasma bolt. The impact should have killed it instantly. Instead, something incredible happened. The plasma bolt hit Ember's scales and dispersed, spreading across the hatchling's body in a corona of brilliant energy that the young dragon somehow absorbed, rather than being destroyed by. And then Ember opened its mouth and screamed. It was not a chirp or a growl or any sound that the Karethi had ever documented from a hatchling. It was a roar, a full adult roar of rage and power that shook the walls and shattered every piece of glass in the room. And with that roar came fire, not the small flames that Ember had been practicing for months, but a torrent of destruction that would have made adult Karethi proud. A wall of burning devastation that slammed into Draxus and his followers with the force of a starship engine. The attackers were thrown backward through the door, their weapons melting in their hands, their scales scorched and cracked by heat that exceeded anything they had been prepared for. Ember landed in front of Elara, wings spread wide, body positioned to shield her from any further attacks, its eyes blazing with a light that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than its flame gland. "Mine," it said, the word clear and unmistakable despite the chaos. "My mama mine." Draxus tried to rise, tried to bring his damaged weapon to bear. But before he could act, the corridor filled with Imperial guards, and at their head was Emperor Vexarian himself. The Emperor took in the scene with a single glance. The smoking attackers, the protective stance of his heir, the human woman standing untouched behind her small, fierce guardian. "You attacked my heir," the Emperor said to Draxus, his voice colder than the void between galaxies. "I was trying to save the Empire," Draxus gasped, pain making his words ragged. "The human has corrupted your bloodline. She has taught your heir to be weak." The Emperor looked at Ember, at the scorched marks on the walls, at the melted weapons scattered across the floor. "You call that weak?" he said slowly. Draxus had no answer. The Emperor walked past him toward Alara and Ember, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a being who had seen 10,000 years pass and knew that this moment would be remembered for 10,000 more. He knelt before his heir, bringing his massive ancient head down to the level of the small hatchling who had just faced 20 adult warriors to protect one fragile human. "You defended her," the Emperor said. Ember nodded, a very human gesture that it had learned from Alara. "She is my mama," Ember said firmly. "She held me when I was small and scared. She sang to me. She told me stories. She loved me when no one else would. I will not let anyone hurt her." The Emperor was silent for a long moment, his burning eyes studying the small, fierce creature before him. "I watched my 6 other hatchlings die," he said finally, his voice carrying to every corner of the room through the communication systems he had activated with a thought. "I watched them struggle alone in their thermal chambers, fighting for survival against impossible odds, dying one by one because that was the way of the Korethi, and I did not think to question it." He looked at Alara, at the human woman who had changed everything. "You showed us another way," he said. "You held our dying child when we would not. You loved it when we considered love a weakness. And in return, my heir just defended you with fireborn, not from training or instinct, but from something I had forgotten existed." He turned to address the assembled guards and the watching billions who were surely monitoring every feed from the palace. "For 10,000 years we have called tenderness weakness," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "We have burned away our gentleness and called the ashes strength. But today I watched my heir defend the creature it loves with power that no training could have given it." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We were wrong. It took a species we considered lesser to show us the truth. And I will not compound our error by ignoring the lesson." He gestured to the guards. "Take Draxus and his followers to the cells. They will face trial for treason against the throne and attempted murder of the imperial heir." As Draxus was dragged away, still protesting, the Emperor turned back to Alara. "You will stay," he said. "And it was not a question, not as a prisoner, but as an advisor. You will teach us what we have forgotten. How to hold our young, how to show them they are wanted, how to love them without shame." Alara looked at Ember, at the small dragon who had just saved her life, at the fierce, tender creature she had sung back from the edge of death. "I would be honored." "Your Majesty," she said softly. The Emperor nodded once, then did something that would be remembered in Korethi history books for millennia to come. He reached out and gently touched Ember's head. The first time he had ever touched any of his offspring with anything like affection. "Thank you," he said to the hatchling, "for showing me what strength really looks like." Years later, historians would mark this night as the beginning of the Draconus Empire's golden age. The reforms that followed, known throughout the galaxy as the Chun Protocols, transformed Korethi society from a stagnant empire of cold warriors into something far greater. Parents learned to hold their children and sing to them and tell them stories. Artists emerged from a population that had not created anything beautiful. In 1,000 years, scientists made breakthroughs powered by passion rather than mere duty. Warriors discovered that protecting loved ones gave them strength that pure aggression could never match. The Korethi did not become soft. They became complete. Creatures who could create as well as destroy, who could love as well as conquer, Ara Chun lived the rest of her life among the dragons. Never returning to Earth permanently, though she visited often, she wrote extensively about what she called the universal language of tenderness, and her work became the foundation of an entirely new field of study. Embra grew into one of the greatest rulers the Empire had ever known. Fierce in battle and gentle in peace, never ashamed of either, in every official portrait throughout its long reign. There was a small human figure standing at its side, and in nurseries across 12 star systems. Karethi parents learned to do something their ancestors would have found unthinkable.